At one point in history, deaf people were heavily discriminated against, completely discriminated against, in fact, and they were treated as less than people. People never really gave them opportunities to do normal things or live a normal life. It also took an extremely long time before technology was developed or deaf people had resources to do these normal activities. The way in which deaf people are seen and the way they group together has come a long way through history. I've always been interested in deaf culture, and I've learned small bits of sign language, granted over a long period of time. And through my experience, I began to understand how much deaf culture has come along through history. At some point in life, you will likely be in the presence of or have to interact with a deaf person, and I feel that it might be beneficial to understand a little bit about deaf culture and what their history has been. So, early in history, there was zero advocacy for people. They didn't have resources, they were heavily discriminated against, and like I said, they weren't given the resources to thrive in life. They were living to survive. They also were not able to be in the presence of one another because that's how much they were despised. People didn't want deaf people to have any pleasurable experiences whatsoever. Even though these deaf communities would have been completely formed by deaf people, they did not want deaf people to have any pleasure. Early in the 19th century, philosophers began to grow curious about deaf people and even considered if they were able to achieve abstract thought like non-deaf people. However, they were still heavily discriminated against during this time. The 19th century was one of the first times advocacy was available for deaf people. This was the first time they were actually seen as humans, and they were given forms of education other than just learning how to lip read. They were given religious training on the Word of God to save their souls. Today, I'll inform you on the history of deaf culture, discrimination of deaf people, and advocacy for deaf people. So, let's start with the early ages of deaf culture. I already basically touched on this. There's not much to say about it. They didn't have any support from the public whatsoever. They were heavily discriminated against, and there were no resources for them to thrive in life. And that's about the extent of it. Deaf people lived to survive. The early ages were the darkest ages for the people, but the 18th century brought a small bit of hope for deaf people. Although they were still heavily discriminated against, people began to question whether deaf people were able to think like people without disabilities, which obviously we know now they can. They just simply can't hear. Even though they still had minute amounts of advocacy, in 1776 there was the first form of education for deaf people, and these schools mostly revolved around lip reading and simple life tools for them to at least be able to function in life. And according to Britannica's History of the Deaf, in Europe, the Enlightenment brought about a new faith in reason and a new curiosity on the part of scholars about the ability of deaf people to achieve rational and abstract thought. This showed a bit of light for deaf people as they were at least being researched and aroused curiosity. This era slowly led to the progression of complex advocacy for deaf people. Within the 19th century, new forms of education were beginning to be established. Specifically, these forms of education revolved around religious training, specifically on the Word of God, And this was due to the fact that they were beginning to be seen as people, and so if they were seen as people, obviously they wanted to save their souls. In 1817, these two people right here, Laurent Clerc and Thomas Gaudet, they founded the American School for the Deaf, and Clerc was a heavy influencer on what we know today as American Sign Language. There was a public discourse on people's views of deaf people, and people began to understand that their minds could work in complex ways as well. According to Joseph Murray in History of the Deaf, this public discourse emphasized the need for training deaf people to become good national citizens. Lindsay Patterson in History Through Deaf Eyes claims that with this public discourse, there was a movement called the Oralist Movement, and this supported the suppression of sign language and the progression of deaf people and deaf communities. Although American Sign Language was suppressed and they were still heavily discriminated against, people began to fully grasp the concept of the mind of deaf people. And discrimination and suppression gradually got better up until modern day. So today I have gone over deaf culture and how we treat deaf people, along with the resources provided for them to live normal lives. Eventually you will likely have to deal with a deaf person in the future, and it might be beneficial to understand a little bit about their history. And the perception of these people should be equal to people without disabilities, whether they decide to use the resources available to them or not. Thank you.